Now, before we get started today, just some brief housekeeping. We'll be recording this webinar so that we can post it on the website for those who can't join us today to listen to it later. We expect the main presentation to last around 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period after that. And as usual with webinars, we will have all of your lines muted, but we encourage any questions that you might have, either as we're going through the presentation or of course for the Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please type them out and send your message to the host in your message window. Okay, so as a quick run through of today's presentation, we are going to be joined by three Ipieca experts who've helped to develop the Paris puzzle materials. First of all, we have Brian Sullivan, who is our Executive Director here at Ipieca, and he's been in the role for exactly 4 years today. Next, we have Margaret Mystery from Statoil, and she is the Head of Sustainability Communication and was also on our Paris Puzzle development group. And finally, we have Arthur Lee. He's a Fellow with Chevron and Principal Advisor and has a long career in the energy environmental field, and has previously served on Ipieca's Climate Change Working Group as its chair, and was also, of course, heavily involved in the development of this work. So thank you to all three for joining us. And the presentation is going to be kicked off by Brian, who will give us a bit of background to Ipieca and the climate challenges we see it. Then Margaret is going to take us through the introduction to the Paris puzzle, right through to the role of natural gas, and then Arthur will talk about the four remaining key components of solutions as we see them, before handing back to Brian for the summary. And with that, I will hand over to Brian now.
Hello everyone, I'm Brian Sullivan. It's my privilege to be the Executive Director of Ipieca. One of the things I love about this job is it's at the intersection of three important subjects for the world. There's global politics, sustainability, and the oil and gas industry. And I care very deeply about all three. The Ipieca is a unique organisation established over 40 years ago to represent the oil and gas industry on environmental and social issues. And our aim is to better enable oil and gas companies to meet societal expectations for environmental and social performance. And one of the unique features about us is that we're the only global association involving both upstream and downstream industry. We have two key roles. The first is to be the industry's principal channel of communication with the United Nations, which is the reason we were formed in 1974 at their request. And the second role is to convene over 500 global experts, two of whom are joining this call, speaking after me in this webinar, who develop, share and promote good practice and solutions. They enhance, communicate knowledge and understanding, engaging members and others in industry, and working in partnership with key stakeholders, some of whom I'm aware of are actually on this call. One thing I will say is that in terms of what we are not, is we're not a lobby group, so we don't lobby governments as an organisation. That is not part of our mandate. So to become a member of Ipieca, you need to be an oil and gas company involved in exploration, production or refining of oil and gas. Or you can be an industry association representing members of that population. We have 37 corporate members and 16 association members, and altogether our global membership produces over 60% of the world's oil and gas. As you can see from the slide, we're a very diverse group in terms of geography, and you can see from the logos there are a very diverse range of companies with different ownership models, such as state companies, listed companies, or private holdings, all of whom have their own unique portfolio of stakeholders. We're a consensus-based organisation, and what you're going to hear today is the consensus view of this global group. And achieving consensus, while it can be challenging, and it's very similar to our key stakeholder, the UN, sometimes in achieving consensus, but when we do achieve consensus, it's very powerful, and we hope you'll get a sense of that from the messaging that we're doing today. So Ipieca recognises that addressing the risks of climate change is the challenge for our generation, and will be for generations to come. There are other elements to this challenge as well which make it even more complex, such as while mitigating and managing the risks of climate change, we also have to meet the world's growing energy needs and enable economic development. It's a bit like having to fix a car while it's still moving. But addressing this challenge is going to require actions from all parts of society. We'll need significant policy action, technology developments, and business response in order to, over many decades, in order to overcome this challenge. And the oil and gas industry can and wants to play a key role as part of the solution. So the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report found that warming is proportional to the cumulative release of CO2 into the atmosphere over time. You can see from the graphic that atmospheric CO2 has increased from 275 ppm in 1750 to 400 ppm today. The cumulative release of 1 trillion tonnes of carbon will likely result in the warming of the climate system by approximately 2 degrees C, with roughly 500 billion tonnes already emitted. In its central scenario, the IEA World Energy Outlook 2014 projects that a 2 degrees C carbon budget will be used up by 2040, in our lifetime, in other words. Addressing this is going to require, the political consensus has been achieved earlier in the COP held in Cancun a few years ago. So the global political system has already reached agreement on 2 degrees C as a goal for addressing climate change. And the political leadership has also recognised that this requires deep cuts in emissions in order to keep within the 2 degrees scenario. And this is something that we all have our role to play in. So the rise in greenhouse gas emissions is a collective global issue and requires the efforts from all aspects of society to address it. And although coal, oil and gas has enabled social development over the last 200 years, its use has contributed to the rise in greenhouse gases. And although energy has been the main source, the rise in greenhouse gas emissions has come from other sources too. And you can see from the graphic that 59% has come from energy consumption, 10% from energy production, and you'll understand why we've separated the two elements out later in this presentation, and 17% has come from energy and agriculture. I'm now going to hand over to Margaret Mystery from Statoil, who, as you've heard, has played a key role on behalf of the industry in this particular piece of work. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Brian. So I want to talk about the Paris puzzle. Ipieca and the oil and gas industry must be a part of the climate change solution. The industry's history of innovation, global reach, knowledge and technical expertise uniquely positions it to help develop and provide credible future energy solutions. Ipieca has created the Paris puzzle to highlight efforts intended to address climate change and demonstrate our commitment to meeting the challenge. Collectively, the pieces of the puzzle highlight the fundamental role and contribution of the industry in addressing the challenge of a transition to a low emissions future. These pieces of the puzzle include meeting energy needs, effective policy, managing our emissions, natural gas, and carbon capture and storage. And the industry is already addressing many pieces of the puzzle. Ipieca supports and encourages governments in their efforts to reach an effective and clear international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to manage the risks of climate change. we recognise that a low-emissions global energy system would look significantly different from today, and that such a transformation would be a major challenge to accomplish. Transforming the global energy system to be low carbon would require extensive changes to many parts of society and economy. Significant support for mitigation technologies and approaches would be needed. Energy economics and consumption patterns would need to change substantially, and consumers would need to accept these shifts. Whatever the final destination, society, policymakers, business and civil society should start now in making the long transition. Energy demand is anticipated to grow by 37% through to 2040, a trend strongly linked with the growth of the global population, which is predicted to increase by 1.7 billion by 2040. As energy consumption in the developed world nears a plateau, developing countries will account for most future energy demand growth. Access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all has been recognised by the UN as a priority in its Sustainable Development Goals and will be key in supporting these growing economies. Oil and gas play a significant role in our lives as they're essential to the development of products used every day and to the stimulation of economic growth. The widespread use of oil and gas arises from their many important benefits, including energy density, storability, transportability, flexibility of use, and affordability. Together, oil and gas currently provide over 50% of global primary energy supply. As economies develop, hundreds of millions of people will buy their first refrigerators, air conditioners, and vehicles. Regardless of the energy source these will use, producing them will require new factories, power plants and infrastructure and global supply chains. This entails energy for construction, manufacturing and processing, transport of heavy goods and delivery to consumers. Much of this energy is predicted to come from oil and gas. The IEA expects low-carbon energy production to grow by 90% between 2012 and 2040. And this growth represents an increase from supplying 18% to over 25% of global energy needs. Nevertheless, the IEA's new policy scenario projects oil and gas will remain the majority source of energy supply. Oil and gas demand is projected to grow by 30% from 2012 to 2040. Natural gas has a critical role to play in today's and tomorrow's secure and diverse energy mix, as it's a cleaner burning and increasingly accessible, affordable, abundant and flexible energy source. The maturity and reliability of natural gas technology also makes it a dependable baseload fuel that has the flexibility to support peak demand response, which is needed due to the intermittency of some renewable energy sources. Natural gas provides a complementary, inexpensive, responsive and low-carbon bedrock for electricity provision. Flexibility is offered by liquefied natural gas. For example, China imports increasingly large volumes for domestic use. Although LNG has more life cycle emissions than natural gas, total emissions from LNG when used to produce electricity are lower than coal. Even under IEA's most ambitious low-carbon policy scenario, the 450 parts per million scenario, natural gas demand continues to increase until at least 2040. With that, I'm going to hand over to Arthur to talk about managing our emissions.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. I think we want to also tell you about how managing our own emissions from our industry makes very important contributions to reducing emissions. At the same time, we also encourage our customers of our fuels to also reduce their consumption and also become more efficient. So improving energy in the production of oil and gas is something that we have been doing for a long time, and we are continuing to do. And so in meeting this global challenge, the industry is heavily investing in new technologies and doing a lot of research and development, including in areas of new extraction, new production, new processing methods, improved technologies and efficiency of the equipment in the field itself, energy efficient design of new plants, and when we retrofit, also put in more efficient equipment, and certainly in the use of advanced computer modeling and all of that, and computer controls, process controls in our facilities to become even more efficient in both in production and refining and other processing. Now, since the 1970s, energy efficiency measures across the world's largest energy consuming countries have reduced their energy consumption by an amount equivalent to the annual energy usage of the European Union. Now, without anticipated improvements in the production and end-use efficiency, the IEA in the World Energy Outlook had said that the forecasted energy demand in 2040 would be nearly 15% higher. So this is a major contributor to emissions reduction or avoidance, if you will. Now, further, we also encourage not only reducing our own emissions, but also try to help our customers of our fuels, consumers of our fuels, to reduce their emissions. And our industry has been participating in research and development of better vehicle design, better vehicle engine design to produce, to really reduce the use of gasoline and diesel, and really help these modern engines to perform at their best. Now, developing and using lower carbon fuels, such as, of course, biofuels, can also be an important way to reduce overall emissions, and we have done that. Many of our companies have done research and development in that area and produce such fuels in compliance with applicable laws. The industry is continuing to develop new natural gas resources. As Margaret has mentioned, natural gas is, of course, the cleanest burning fossil fuel, and we have continued and are continuing to develop these resources and technology that will use these resources at a much more efficient manner. Now, companies are indeed continuing to do more research in this area, and also many of our companies have also invested in solar and wind power in addition to production of biofuels and doing research in biofuels. Now, in some of our most productive areas, we have also been reducing flaring of natural gas that is associated with oil production in some countries. So in my company, for example, in Chevron, since 2009, offshore Nigeria, we have in our Agbami production facility has been operating with no routine flaring because the associated gas is reinjected, showing that a new and productive production facility can be operated without routine flaring. And as an industry, we have also conducted numerous consumer education campaigns to encourage consumers to use less fuel, such as Save More Fuel campaigns. And emissions from oil and gas production, transport, and refining between 2005 and projected to 2030 could be reduced by as much as 14% from a business as usual case through measures such as these process changes that I've mentioned, energy efficiency improvements, and carbon capture and storage, which I will talk about next. we believe, and certainly have positioned ourselves to develop carbon capture and storage technologies. Many of our companies have. We believe it is a key technology for delivering significant emission reductions during this century. Now, without it, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have projected that deep cuts in emissions are likely to be a lot more costly and at worst unachievable. Because looking at the IPCC projections at a 450 parts per million scenario, many of the models that the IPCC have used, the ensemble of models, have shown that the cost could be as much as 2.5 times higher than what a base case would have been. And at worst, in some cases, the models that IPCC used in projecting this emission reduction show that it was not possible to even achieve that 450 parts per million without CCS. So IPCC itself has done a lot of that modeling over, I think, about 1,200 scenarios that they have done. So now CCS is on its way. At Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan, SaskPower has already commissioned and started operating in 2014 the Boundary Dam Unit Number 3 that has a net capacity of 120 megawatts. And this is the first commercial power plant to come online with CO2 capture. The Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, or Global CCS Institute, has also in their annual status of CCS report had informed the world that there are 22 large-scale CCS projects that are either in operation or under construction and have a collective CO2 capture capacity of around 40 million tons a year. That's the opportunity for CCS, but there are also barriers in its development, and we fully recognize that. Deployment of CCS on large scale will make this material contribution to reducing CO2 emissions, but these barriers have to be addressed. And you can see on the graphics here, high costs and the business model along the value chain, regulations and policies, and certainly long-term liability issues when we finish injection and storage. And looking for large-scale storage sites will always be a challenge, and we will always look for those sites that can provide the safety and integrity of storage. And certainly, last but not least, and probably most important, is public acceptance of this technology. So CCS deployment really has to be triggered by a high enough cost for emitting CO2 that is either done through legislation or market-based mechanisms such as emission trading or carbon tax, and a high enough value for CO2 either as a product, such as doing enhanced oil recovery, to offset that CCS cost, that is using CO2 for enhanced oil production. Also, it could be that the high enough price premium paid by consumers on the lower carbon products, such as lower carbon electricity or oil or steam or liquefied natural gas, or even in the future with steel production, cement production, or any other low carbon product where we are sequestering or storing CO2, consumers willing to pay for it would mean that we can do CCS. And also, of course, if the law mandates such a requirement, then CCS will have to be done. Now, Ipieca believes that the barriers to widespread CCS deployment can be overcome, and the oil and gas industry is continuing to develop CCS technologies and projects, as well as addressing these barriers. So, let me then turn to some of these barriers, and one of the areas is about effective policy. Okay, policy, of course, has to be science-based. Really requires, and we encourage as an industry association, encourage global participation And as an industry, we certainly believe in markets and the way markets work, and we want to let markets drive the selection of solutions while supporting the development of pre-commercial to low-carbon technologies. As Brian has mentioned, and Margaret as well, we certainly recognize the long-term nature of addressing the risk of climate change, and we certainly would like to see policies that provide these long-term signals and certainties to the marketplace. These policies need to be transparent to all stakeholders while minimizing complexity and administrative and transaction costs. And these policies ought to address both mitigation and adaptation measures. So with that, let me turn it back over to Brian Sullivan. Brian?
Okay, thank you, Arthur, and also thank you for your contribution to the work over many years in Ipieca on this. So, yeah, just to summarise then, so the risks of climate change are a challenge for our generation and for those to come that are going to require actions from all parts of society. And the oil and gas industry has a key role to play as part of the solution. We support and encourage governments in their efforts to achieve an effective and clear international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and manage the risks of climate change. But we also believe it's possible to address climate change risks while also meeting growing global energy demand and supporting economic development. We as a society need a sustained open dialogue. We invite you to engage with us in further conversations on this topic. And I'd like to offer Ipieca as a channel to engage with companies that produce 60% of the world's oil and gas. We're willing to engage and we want to collaborate to meet the challenge. You'll find more detail on this particular topic in a pack called the Paris Puzzle. It and all the other great stuff Ipieca produces is freely available on the Ipieca website, ipieca.org. With that, I'll thank you and hand over to Rob Civita, who's going to be dealing with the questions.
Great, thanks, Brian. Okay, so yeah, please. We've had a few questions in already, and the message window is still open if you'd like to submit your questions now. And thanks again to all our presenters today. So first question is, what will Ipieca be doing to communicate these messages?
Okay, I'll take that. Thank you, Rob. So Ipieca is, we're engaging with, in a range of ways with key stakeholders, so some on an individual basis. So, for example, we recently held meetings with UNFCCC and UNEP on this particular topic. We're also presenting this at industry conferences to share the message, because it's just as important to share this message within the industry as it is to share it beyond the industry. So there'll be this event and others like it to come. So this program of activity will continue well into 2016.
Great. Okay, thank you, Brian, for that. The next question that we've had is, what is the role of the companies and the industry at COP21 and in the FCCC process? So perhaps Margaret or Arthur?
Sure, I can take that one. I think that the UN has very clearly in the run-up to COP21 invited the private sector and business to be active and to engage in the run-up to Paris and recognise our role. The UN recognises our role as implementers, if you like, of the agreement that's reached there. So I think that it's really important for us to encourage that process, to encourage the the nations represented to reach a good agreement and to support that.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next up, we have a couple of CCS questions. So the first one is, where do you think we'll see CCS coming up most in the next 10 years?
Okay. Rob, you want me to take that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think as I try to describe, there are hurdles to this, but as well there are opportunities. Certainly, the most important point is to be able to find that to have safety and integrity of storage. So finding those geologic sites that have those characteristics, and of course we do a lot of research and a lot of analysis of those sites before any of our companies would undertake such a major project. So that's very important. And of course, as I mentioned too, policies will be key to this, and the cost of capture and storage. So those are the hurdles that we need to overcome. So I certainly cannot say for you and predict where some of these projects would come in greater numbers than other places, but certainly we have to look at all of these factors before any such projects, major projects, are undertaken. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Arthur. And a slightly more broader question, possibly more challenging. What do we see as the business case for CCS?
Okay, I think again, well, with business case, I also mentioned that if there is a high enough CO2 emission cost, such as either from the market clearing price of a market mechanism like a cap and trade, or a carbon tax that's sufficiently high, that will certainly become more of a driver or incentive for any company to then look at that to reduce CO2 emissions in a major way using CCS. At the same time, of course, if there are consumers who are willing to pay for the cost of CCS as part of that product, as I mentioned, either some sort of low carbon electricity that they're getting, or liquefied natural gas, such as what some of our projects are being developed as LNG projects, including from some of the member companies like Shell and Chevron, and of course Statoil, where CCS projects make sense. That business sense is when consumers are willing to pay for that storage, the CCS technology and cost, as well as policies from governments that drive that. So I think I've touched on all of that as part of any business case for a major project like CCS. Thank you for that question.
Thanks there, Arthur. Okay, so moving on a little bit, so a question on diesel. Would Ipieca consider taking a position on the diesel debate, where it appears CO2 has trumped NOx despite the alleged harm in cities? Brian?
Okay, so Ipieca has a fuels and products working group which has been active for many years, and as through that group it has been part of the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles with UNEP, and that partnership gets involved in a number of issues or aspects associated with clean fuels and vehicles, whether it be from lead through to sulfur, through to other air emissions, and this forum is something that we're very actively involved in. We also work with, in collaboration with our other industry associations, so bodies like CONCAWI in Europe and API in the US, to look at these particular issues.
Okay, thanks for that input. Okay, so I'm now going to combine a couple of questions together here. Firstly, does the gas sector have a commitment or pledge for COP21 around addressing climate change? And similarly, slightly more specific, under the UNFCCC process, some of the national governments, France and Peru, along with the UN, have launched the Lima Paris Action Agenda, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, to catalyse non-state actors' action and involvement in the energy transition. Do we, as Ipieca, envisage presenting a commitment or the members' commitment under that process? For example, around emissions reductions or investment targets for low carbon technologies. So I think part of that is part of those questions are for the members directly, and part is for Ipieca to answer. Arthur or Margaret, would you like to start out from a company view?
Sure, I can take that question, Rob. I'll actually start from the Ipieca point of view, and Ipieca's role is actually not to lobby, as Brian mentioned earlier, and neither is it to define targets or minimum standards, but rather what Ipieca is aiming at is to be an enabler of good practice, make fact-based information available globally in the industry and to our stakeholders, and to use its convening power to get industry together with key stakeholders to address climate and energy issues. Now, that said, some of the member companies in Ipieca and Statoil in particular will or have already set targets on the emissions. So speaking to Statoil specifically, we have targets on carbon intensity in different segments of our portfolio. Another target that we adopted is to do with flaring, and to eliminate routine flaring by 2030. Now, Arthur mentioned Chevron's efforts in this area, and similarly, Statoil works very hard on flaring reduction, but it's not eliminated yet, routine flaring. So I think having this target for 2030 is really something to work hard towards and strive for. But that's just a couple of examples of targets that Statoil has as a member company. Ipieca's role is not about targets.
Okay, let me address that question as well. Thank you, Margaret. Yes, I think as an Ipieca member company, speaking as an Ipieca person, certainly Chevron participates in the UNFCCC strictly as an observer, as a member of the Ipieca delegation. So my role is very clear. In the last 16 years that I've participated, is strictly as an observer. Having said that, separate from the UNFCCC proceedings, Chevron, as I mentioned, have already been hard at work in reducing our own emissions. I've mentioned already the flaring, no routine flaring at one of our major facilities in Western Africa, the Akbami facility. Certainly, we have reduced emissions from our energy efficiency improvements since 1992 by at least 34% over those many years. So, as a company, we have taken that kind of action to really reduce emissions and setting annual goals. For over the last decade now, we have set annual goals that we have met each year in avoiding or avoiding new emissions, and certainly keeping our emissions flat for the last decade. So thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Speaking of flaring, we have a flaring question here. So gas flaring reduction was mentioned as an important mitigation option for the industry. What is Ipieca's view of the World Bank's Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative? Brian?
Okay, I'll take this. So, yeah, this is a very important initiative that is building momentum all the time. And I know that a number of Ipieca members are actively considering joining it. Some have already committed, as you heard from Margaret talking about Statoil there. Ipieca has actually been a channel of communication with World Bank where we have raised awareness of this initiative across our membership. And one of the things is, and going back to the commitments question just before, so one of the things that Ipieca brings is that as a forum for the industry to discuss between themselves how they are responding to this particular issue, so that practices and policies can be understood and good practice can be shared.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. We've still got a few more questions coming in. So actually this one was from a little bit earlier. So does Ipieca support the use of market-based mechanisms to stimulate GHG reduction investment? Well, it says here, or does it favour the application of a carbon tax? I assume that question is kind of around the difference between an emissions trading scheme versus a carbon tax, because they're both market-based mechanisms. And I might ask either of the companies to comment here. Obviously, our general view is covered in the effective policy fact sheet. Margaret or Arthur, would you care to comment?
Sure, I can perhaps make a start, Arthur, and do fill me in if I miss anything. I think it's really important to say that for a long time, Ipieca members and several of our companies have been participating in these market-based mechanisms. So, for example, Statoil has paid a carbon tax in Norway for the last 20 years, actually, and that's been a very effective means of driving down emissions on the Norwegian continental shelf. So members have been participating in these mechanisms around the world and gaining a lot of experience in the use of these tools. And where these mechanisms don't exist, so in areas where there is no carbon market, many of us use what's called an internal shadow carbon price, which is a cost that we include in our evaluation of projects and investments as a proxy for a carbon price. And that increases the robustness and resilience of our strategies and our investments. I think where governments choose to enact policies that address the risk of climate change, a lot of economic studies have found that revenue-neutral market-based mechanisms, including carbon pricing, are more economically efficient than regulation or technology mandates or performance standards. So I think it's pretty much a shared Ipieca view that market-based mechanisms are preferred. Arthur, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add very briefly. Thank you, Margaret. First of all, I'd like to echo what Margaret has said. I mean, it is Ipieca's view, and you can see that in the fact sheet, that where governments choose to have market-based mechanisms, it's been found by groups out there, research organizations such as MIT that we've cited, such as MIT, saying that really market mechanisms are more effective in terms of lower cost and also more effective in reducing emissions than perhaps other standards, performance standards and other direct regulations. Certainly as a company, I want to also echo what Margaret has said, where companies have internal carbon pricing, and Chevron too has has had imposed an analysis on our major capital projects on carbon pricing, with a carbon price as part of the business case development for over a decade now. So we have been doing that, and so we're certainly well versed in those issues. So I'll just leave it at that to add to what Margaret had said. Thank you for that question.
Okay, great. Thanks both for that. So we've got another couple more questions. First of all, is CCS included, or will it be included in Ipieca's Energy and Greenhouse Gas Efficiency Compendium? So for those of you who don't know, that's one of Ipieca's good practice work products is our Energy Efficiency and Greenhouse Gas Compendium. It enables our members to learn good practice and implement that around various processes and units across their facilities. No, we don't currently have, and I'll answer this one. No, we don't currently have CCS as one of the sort of 30 or so, I think, we have topics now on the compendium on the website. However, it is under consideration. I think at this stage, CCS is not widely enough utilised for a clear, a concise set of good practices like that. There are, and so it would be a little bit early in the day to be including that topic. Okay.
But Rob, if I could just say something here as well. Certainly, the strength of Ipieca is that not only do we have these consensus views on policies, but also, as we've mentioned before, Ipieca is an enabling organization for many of our companies. So these best practices guidance, whether it's in energy efficiency or other areas of our production and processing, really have been is one of the major strengths of Ipieca as a global organization, bringing together such expertise, with so many member companies, but also a network of other associations where we can share best practices. So that's I think that's a good point that was brought up.
Great, thanks, Arthur. Okay, and it's looking like one final question to wrap up with. This is looks like quite an interesting one. So, are the current low oil prices an incentive for exploration and production companies to invest in energy efficient projects, or do they actually hinder new developments?
Okay, I'll have a go, and perhaps we're talking about energy efficiency projects here, and across the membership, and this is and you can see examples or information about this in the energy efficiency compendium on the Ipieca website. But oil and gas companies will be invest in energy efficiency projects all the time, because this is one of those fantastic win-wins where not only can emissions reductions be delivered, but obviously there are economic benefits associated with the reduction in use of energy. Obviously different companies have different pressures on them in times of low oil prices, but there is always a business case for energy efficiency, no matter what the oil price is.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, if I could just make a quick point on that as well to reinforce the point. I think, as I mentioned earlier, for one company, for Chevron, we have increased energy efficiency, our energy performance since 1992 by about 34%, and continuing to do that. And of course, over that time period, we've seen cycles in the business cycles for our industry, low oil price, high oil price, and yet we continue to have those improvements. So that's just to reinforce what Brian had just said. Energy efficiency always makes a good business case, and certainly it will compete with other investments, but certainly when it does make business sense, we continue to do that as member companies. So thanks for raising that point.
Great. Margaret, anything to add? No?
I think Brian covered it
Yep.
perfectly. Low cost and low emissions go hand in hand.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you again. That brings us to the end of the questions we received. So thanks everyone on the line for your questions. Hopefully you found the answers and the presentation today informative. Again, you can obviously find all of the information from our website, and we will be posting a recording of this up to the website shortly. So thanks to all our presenters, and thanks to you for joining. Okay, goodbye.